We'll be discussing a very topical question. There's a lot of triumphalism in Kenya's public sector and the media in general at the conclusion of the African Climate Summit, which was hosted by the government of the Republic of Kenya. Wide range of people. The estimate is between 20 to 30,000 people attended, Kenyans, Africans, and obviously from other parts of the world. A lot of commitments were made. And remember, this was basically discussing the question of warming and a concrete solution. The declaration contained a lot of commitments, or rather platitudes, in addition to obviously calling for action beyond the agreement. I think stemming from the fact that it is now accepted that an excess pollution of carbon has certain consequences. I agree that there are fringe voices somewhere who still do not think that the science suggests what the rest of us read. But nevertheless, I think we should go with the fact that, yes, there's a sensible view, actually a strong view, that there's a need to respond. Now, the options for responses are varied, and obviously an agreement around them around the globe is one thing to consider. Now, as COP28 comes in a couple of months as well, I think some of the content from the African Climate Summit and the conclusions that led from it will actually be tested, whether meaningful change could be activated, but more importantly, how to inform policy at individual level and obviously through a global compact. So as a guest of the Institute of Economic Affairs, Peter Doyle is an economist, and his work more recently has been basically to examine more critically the question of climate change and to see, to ask himself, he asks himself, and actually will be making a presentation to us on what he thinks some of the solutions are. He will also come down to asking whether the much celebrated declaration from Nairobi, which many people have now called the Nairobi Declaration. I don't think that's how it appeared in the text, but the media have called it the Nairobi Declaration. So let's accept that as the moniker for the time being. What is it? What did they get right? What was the assessment? And how realistic or even plausible are some of the claims that they made regarding those solutions? So without further ado, I'll call Peter to make a presentation. He'll make a presentation for about 35 minutes, and then I'll open it up for this conversation. So to the rest of us who are here, thank you very much for attending the IEA's meeting. And we have this choice. Please take your questions. You can type them in the chat box, and I'll read them later. Or at the end of Peter's conclusion, we'll have about an hour for a question and answer session from you all. So welcome to this meeting, and Peter, you may go ahead.
Okay, Kwame and Institute, thank you very much for hosting this presentation. All right, so I've heard quite a number of comments on the Nairobi summit. Indeed, Kwame's used the word platitudes in his introduction to it, quite critical of the summit, that it was a talking shop, that the pledges were too small and meaningless and so on. I have to say that is not my view. My view is that the most important thing about this climate summit is that it happened at all. And I take that view because a view I'm going to introduce and hope to persuade you of today. My view is that the world will not get control of its temperature until Africa asserts its global governance of that matter. Let me say that again. My view is that the world will not get control of its temperature until Africa asserts its global governance of that matter. Now, that's a somewhat unexpected and unintuitive proposition, as I say, I hope to persuade you of. But given that that is my view, the fact that this meeting happened at all is of great significance, because it marks the Africans stepping up their role in this matter in a very public, high-profile way. That said, of course, the Nairobi Declaration has a number of limitations, which those who make it clearly were aware of. The recommendations are at a very high level of abstraction. There's clearly a diversity of views across the African continent on what exactly to do, and some quite sharp differences of view. And you can see that this is the key paragraph, a key paragraph from that. Just look at the first line there. We would urge leaders to rally behind a proposal for a global carbon taxation regime. Look at the word global in that opening line. It's in square brackets and bolded. That indicates that there was heated debate amongst the leaders over that word, should it be in there or not. And the fact that the square brackets appear in the final issued declaration tells me, at least, that there is considerable divergence of views on this key matter, and this matter I will address this morning. In addition, the leaders delegated to the internal machinery of the African Union the task of converting this Nairobi Declaration into a concrete, specific set of proposals for the Africans to take to the next COP. I can assure you that's not a matter of dotting I's and crossing T's, because there's such a high level of abstraction, such diversity of views. What this does is essentially give to the internal African Union machinery a hot potato, use my pun, to sort it out. But that is my cue for today. I am going to propose to you a set of specific proposals which would meet the spirit and thrust of the Nairobi Declaration, which I claim would actually substantively advance the task of dealing with global warming, and which could get unanimous support amongst the Africans for it. In order to make my case, it's important that you grasp that the present global policy framework on warming, which is combined is three numbers: 1.5 degrees Celsius, net zero, 2050. That's the policy framework. That policy framework has three absolutely fundamental failings that need to be fixed. The first one is it does not yield control of global temperatures. You can see that because if you look at the projections for global temperatures that scientists are giving us, they have this over the next 50 to 100 years. They have an enormous range from 1.5 up to 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. The scientists are not unsure of the science. They are quite clear about what the connection is between the stock of emissions in the world and global temperatures. What they're not sure about, and what gives rise to this very wide fan, is they're not certain about what the stock of emissions will be. They're not certain about the economics. That's the key. The issue is economics rather than science. And those three numbers do not give the scientists a clear path for the projection of the stock of emissions, so therefore they can't clearly project global temperatures. The second core failing of those three numbers is that they're not based on efficiency. Now that sounds like a cold abstraction, efficiency. To give you an intuitive grasp of just how important that is, what a fundamental failing that is, I'm going to give you an analogy. Let us say that you're in your car and you are stopped at a red traffic light, and I smash into the back of you, and you get out and say, oh, we mustn't talk about the blame game, let's talk about finance. What that arrangement does is encourage bad driving. If drivers know that they can smash into the back of stopped vehicles and face essentially no penalty, it encourages bad driving. To convert that analogy back to warming, the rich world smashed into the back of Africa by emitting emissions over the past century and a half. And in that context, the rules do not require, present rules do not require those who broke the system to fix it. And so they carry on emitting, which is, of course, what they are now doing. So the absence of efficiency is a core reason why we do not have control. And last, those three numbers say nothing about growth. Now, you may say that's a bit surprising because there's a lot of talk at the summit, wasn't there, about green growth and all these other things. But in fact, it's totally absent from the policy framework, yielding, on the one hand, a bunch of people in the rich world who say we must have degrowth to solve the warming problem. They never specify degrowth by whom or how or any details, but they're there. And a group of other people in the developing world, including in Kenya, saying, hold on, we've had enough degrowth for the past 500 years, we'd like some growth, actually. Yielding global policy logjam. Now, those three problems are not some abstraction to be solved by some, big players somewhere else in the world. Those are Africa's problem. They're Africa's problem because you are first in line for the climate hits, as most recently, of course, in the floods in Libya going on as I speak. In addition, and this may surprise you somewhat, given the diversity of views that we saw amongst African leaders at the summit, warming is an issue on which there is absolutely universal African agreement. When I say, and I don't mean amongst the countries, I mean amongst all 1.4 billion of you, all of you are of the opinion in regard to Africa that it is hot enough here already. That makes warming the ultimate Pan-African issue. And it's all of this is Africa's problem for another reason, because in the context where you are first in line for hits from climate and therefore from the failures of the policy regime, where you are all agreed that it's hot enough already, the rest of the world is treating you with great contempt. There's the fact of global warming itself, which is for their material benefit at your expense. There's the chaos and inadequacy of the global policy framework. There is no accountability. Are we on track? Are we off track? No clear means of measuring that. There is conditionality in climate, which is applied to the poor countries who didn't make the problem and not applied to the rich countries who did, and on and on. All of this is treating Africa on warming with great contempt. These three matters make these core failings in the policy framework Africa's problem, and Africa's problem to fix. How do you fix it? Here comes my proposals. In order to do that, the Africans need to propose a set of ideas based upon economic efficiency. What does that mean? Well, we start with the work of this gentleman. This is Arthur Cecil Pigou, who introduced economics 100 years ago to the notion of externalities. And that's a notion which many economists use to advocate a global carbon tax as the solution to global warming. But that application of his idea of externalities is subject to three core failings. It doesn't work. The first one is that logic muddles up stocks and flows, the most basic of economic logic failings. In his original formulation of externalities, you have a noisy neighbor making noise, which is a flow, which you can correct by the imposition of a Pigouvian tax, returning the offended neighbor back to his preferred position of silence. And if you don't apply the Pigouvian tax, you have considerable inefficiency and loss of economic value. But that is not what is happening with warming. To see why it's not happening with, well, it's not what happens with warming, consider the following. Let us say that the world did impose a global carbon tax, which was correctly parameterized, to yield 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050. In 2050, the bulk of the world, 140 countries, including Kenya, who've made no contribution to the stock of emissions in the world, would still have to live with the disastrous climate and other consequences of 1.5. So that externality is not addressed by a global carbon tax. The second failing of the application of Pigouvian's externality idea in proposing that leads to a global carbon tax is it assumes that warming is a single standalone event, which is not. We have industrialization, emissions, producing warming, got to fix it, a standalone event. But it isn't. Warming is just one manifestation of a class of events, which is international externalizations. And those differ from their domestic counterparts, which Pigou was talking about in various ways. But a key one is you do not have a sovereign to impose a price, a Pigouvian tax, to address the problem. But Africans and those of African descent know in their bones that just because there isn't a sovereign doesn't mean that there isn't a solution, a Pigouvian solution to this problem. Because an earlier episode of international externalization was the Atlantic trade in people from the 15th to the 19th century, based upon the externalization of those people's preference not to be owned. It wasn't solved by the imposition of a Pigouvian tax, it was solved by a long series of precedents, particularly every individual act of resistance to being captured, every mutiny, every riot, every revolution culminating in Haiti in 1804. So that now, thanks to all this precedent, it's utterly unthinkable that this form of international externalization would be legal anywhere. So that's there is a solution to these problems, and I'm going to argue that one should address the problem of warming in a way that sets a precedent for future such international externalizations. And the last failing of the argument that says Pigovian logic leads to a global carbon tax is that in the Pigovian setting, the correct resolution is one which returns the offended party to status ante. In the case of noisy neighbor, returns them to silence. Well, in the case of global warming, where we're trying to address the stock of emissions and not just the flow of emissions, what does status ante redress for the 140 countries, including Kenya, actually mean? What is the goal? What's the standard here? Well, one position would be the way to return Kenya and the others who made no contribution to status ante is that the correct number in the policy framework should not be 1.5 degrees Celsius, it should be 0. That would return all the offended countries back to status ante. A rather dramatic implication, one which you probably don't find credible because you think it's too expensive. It would just be enormously expensive to do that. Emissions since 1950 and probably since 1850 would have to be withdrawn from the atmosphere. Another way to return those 140 countries back to status ante would be to convert compensation for damage from loans to grants. That is, however, almost entirely impractical, not because the rich world simply will politically refuse to do it, but because even if they did, it would be virtually impossible to specify who should receive exactly how much, in what form, when, and so on, by way of compensation, even if it is in the form of grants. The clearest way to return the 140 countries back to status ante, to meet this Pigovian standard, is to render the 140 countries' development now carbon unconstrained. To render them not responsible at all to fix the problem that they did not make. And there's a little plus on the right-hand side there indicating that in addition to that, as the core element of status ante redress, you should also, the rich world and the offenders should provide grant support, grant compensation to the offended countries where the damage can be identified, quantified, and the victims are properly compensated. So a combination of carbon unconstrained and, where feasible to identify, grant form of compensation. In this instance, the net zero for all, the for all bit of that would now become only for the culprits in our policy framework. All right, how do you reconcile if 140 countries, including Kenya, are going to have no carbon constraints in their development from here? How do we make sure that the world still meets 1.5, that we don't go over budget, so to speak, if we've got a chunk of countries unconstrained? For that, we turn to the work of this fellow. This is Jacques Polak, who his main contribution is to develop the techniques behind financial programming at the IMF. Sounds like a bad thing in the ears of many people, but his principles are very simple. It just says you've got to have internal policies to meet an ultimate objective which add up, that they're internally coherent. They need to be broken down, specified into a path for them, so we can measure as we go along if we're on track. And if we discover the third point that we're off track, we need a corrective. That's essentially what I'm proposing for Africa's approach to warming now. You apply Polak programming to the problem of global warming. You start off by saying, okay, well, what is the global carbon budget allocation? How do we carve it up between the main blocks of countries that have to have it? To do that, just to give you an intuition of how this works, here is the path of global temperatures over the past 60 years, showing them rising to 1 degree Celsius. And now on the right-hand side, I'm going to show you the trajectory of the stocks of emissions from each of the main groups. Start with the line at the top, the little green sliver, that's the rest of the world, of 140 countries who have made no contribution to the stock. The red block at the bottom is the OECD contribution, and the third block in blue is the non-OECD big emitters. So think Russia, China, India, Indonesia, and so on. There's 15 countries there. So in order to do the budget allocation, and the POLAC system, we simply, first of all, project that green sliver forward out to 2050 under the assumption that it's unconstrained. You then have from the scientists, the global budget of emissions that is allowed, consistent with 1.5. Subtract your projected emissions from the green block, that yields the residual that's available for the blue and the red blocks. That is how you get to global consistency. Even though the 140 countries in the rest of the world are unconstrained, you still meet the 1.5 target by budgeting for the other two accordingly. Once you've done that, you now need to convert that budget allocation for the two big blocks into numbers that you can track as you go along. Give you an intuition about that. Here are the same three blocks showing their emissions intensity of output over the past 60 years. That's the tons of emissions per unit of real GDP, all blocks having fallen considerably in the past 60 years. So in this instance, we now know what the residual left from the rest of the world projection is from the action we just took. You now take growth, and here we introduce growth into the framework, growth projections for the OECD out to 2050, and for the non-OECD block of big emitters also out to 2050. And from that, you say, if you want to achieve that level of growth, then you derive by simple arithmetic the path for the emissions intensity of output for those two big blocks, the red and the blue block. And that gives you your intermediate targets for the two big blocks. Now, to give you, again, an intuition of how much are we asking for, how big a scale is it, here are, in the baseline projection, the emissions intensities of output paths for all three blocks out to 2050 in the baseline, giving you, at the end of the stage, we just get to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's the baseline. If we now do my programming exercise, I'm going to toggle now. This is what is required under the program, which allows the rest of the world to be emissions unconstrained. Now, I hope a visual, and that's the baseline, that's the program. That's the baseline, that's the program. This is clearly showing how the emissions intensity of output paths have to become more ambitious, but not absurdly more ambitious. This is within the realms of possibility to do. We just need more discipline to make that happen. Then there's the question of enforcement. Well, the first point of enforcement is you've got to measure where you are. Now, these are real numbers based off of the program I've just outlined. This shows you the emissions intensity of output for the OECD, starting at 19.9 in 2019, and we have a target for 21 of 18.4. That's millions of tons of emissions per millions of PPP GDP. So, what was the outturn in 2021? Well, that was the outturn in 2021 for the OECD bloc, showing that they have missed their target, and by a very considerable margin. They are off track. That miss of 0.5 is equivalent to half a year's of the required improvement under the program. And if you look under the hood in that, look first of all at the lowest line of this table now, you can see, however, that the annual emissions for 2021 for the OECD bloc actually were better than the program. So what's going on? How come the emissions intensity of output target, which is the key target, is considerably missed, while emissions are actually slightly lower than targeted under the framework? Well, for your answer, look at the second row, which is the GDP level. And you can see that whereas the assumption in the programming was that GDP in OECD would be 104.3, it's actually much lower. And that's telling you that's the effect of COVID on the world. This is, if you like, degrowth. And this also tells you, this exercise, why the relevant intermediate target should be defined on emissions intensity of output, not on emissions, because the emissions intensity of output gives you the correct signal corrected for the cycle. Same question for the group of non-OECD big emitters. The green square, that was their target for 21. the outturn, that was their outturn, they've also missed. So in other words, this framework is giving you a very clear measure of, are we on track or not? Two numbers, the miss for the OECD and the miss for the group of big non-OECD emitters. So we get clarity out of this approach. Once we've identified that they're off track, we can say, well, who are the worst performers in the two blocks in terms of various measures? And you can see by levels of emissions intensity of output that the worst culprits were Canada, Australia, and Korea. That's the left-hand red row at the top. And on the right-hand, you can see it's Iraq, Kazakhstan, and the Islamic Republic of Iran. But in addition, you can also see that who were the best performers of these groups. And that's important because the first thing, therefore, I think the Africans should do in the COP is report that the targets are missed and report the worst performers. But in this particular case, look, Australia is the worst performer in the OECD. It's in there, but it's also in the green column amongst the most improved. So Australia should be given a pass, and criticism should be directed at Canada and Korea for being the most inefficient producers. And the next country, the third one in line, is the United States. So you measure whether or not we're on track, and if we're off track, you call out the countries in the offending group who are the most inefficient, and bring discipline to bear on them. But of course, these countries cannot be named and shamed into conforming with a discipline on emissions. So instead of a global carbon tax, what I'm going to propose by way of actually enforcing this discipline is an emissions inefficiency tariff, whereby a charge would be levied on, say, the worst three countries, Canada, Korea, and in this case, the United States, because they are members of a bloc that has missed the target, and because they are in that group the worst of the offenders. So they would become liable to a tariff, which would be a heavy tariff, 1% of their GDP, collected, annually applied. Every year we do this exercise I've just gone through, saying have we met the target and who are the worst offenders if we've missed. That system sets up a process of competition in the first instance within the OECD. The OECD countries will now compete with themselves in order to get their emissions intensities down, in order that in future they will not become liable to this very heavy emissions inefficiency tariff. And that gets the whole group emissions intensities down and gets a form of control over that. Notice that this is a tax on the stock, not on the flows, because the tax is only applying to the worst offenders who are responsible for creating the problem. And in no circumstances do the 140 countries who had no role in making this problem become liable for this tax. It is highly parsimonious. We're not interfering in what the OECD countries actually have to do in order to get their emissions and efficiency down. We simply have an aggregate measure and discipline on the aggregate outcome. It's also, as I mentioned, got this triple trigger. Has your block missed its annual target? Who is the worst offender by LECOC? And if you're also, however, on the most improved, then you are off. That's three triggers. And under this system, there would be no role for any border adjustment taxes, because this system would encompass and deal with the global externality. And given that the global externality is addressed by it, there is no need for any other mechanisms to address it, either through border adjustment taxes or through climate conditionality from the IMF or from the others. So who is going to bring all of this about? Well, it's not going to be the rich world, because they're responsible for the stock, so all they want to talk about is the flows. It's not going to be the international financial institutions, because they're owned and controlled by the rich world. It's not going to be the NGOs, who are largely controlled by the rich world as well. It's not going to be the economics profession, despite the coherence of the economics I've just outlined. None of these people are actually going to make this case. The only people who are going to make this case are the Africans and the other 140 countries in the world who have had no role in making this global problem. That is why the world will not get control of this problem until Africa asserts its global governance of this matter. Two last points. In behaving this way, Africa is not behaving as a victim, it's behaving as an adult. You will be proposing a system which actually gets control of global temperatures because it gets control of emissions by applying a system of intermediate targets and enforcement to do so. It is based upon efficiency. Only those who broke the system are responsible to fix it. And it formally accommodates growth, both in the rich world and in the developing world. If you want to grow fast, fine. That means you've got to get your emissions intensity of output down accordingly. And finally, I want to stress, since there's so much call out of the climate for more financing, that what Africa needs out of this is not more financing, it needs more revenue. Let me say that again. Africa does not need more financing, it needs more revenue. And that is what this framework that I am proposing delivers. Let me just quickly go through the revenue streams for Africa that this framework yields. First of all, Africa can fully exploit its carbon assets. That's Africa north of the Limpopo can fully exploit its carbon assets. You can have very effective commercial carbon recapture. Why? Because this disciplining device is now putting a discipline on the rich world to get their carbon emissions down. That raises their demand for carbon recapture as supplied by you. That's more revenue for you. You can also get, in the system I'm proposing, get aggregate Kenyan, say, carbon efficiencies beyond commercial operations. So if you grow trees, lots of them, 30 million by 2030, and that gets your emissions down, under my program system, that would also be eligible to go into the carbon market. You would get paid for doing something that you do not have to do. Africans would also get revenue from the emissions efficiency tariff part. They would get their share of that. The case is made, obviously, to shift compensation from loans to grants in this whole system. To the extent that that is successful, that is more revenue. Your development is now unconstrained by carbon. You do not have to meet emissions targets yourselves. Choose to do so, that is your point. But we've now removed a core constraint off of the development of Africa. If the whole system works and we get control of temperature, that is less climate damage to you, which is more revenue. And all of that increases your debt carrying capacity, which will, as President Ruto desperately wants, get the risk premia, which is Africa has to pay in markets, down. That, in a nutshell, is what I think the African Union machinery should do with its charge now from the Nairobi summit to develop the proposals to take into the forthcoming COP. Thank you very much.
Okay, so basically I won't try to sum up, but let me just say a couple of things that I got from this. I think you said that, yes, you mentioned the three limitations of, apparently it looks like Peter thinks in rules of three. So you took out the three most salient points about the limitations of the African Climate Summit and the declaration. Then you talked about the global framework. I think you say that, yes, it's actually all summarized in three numbers: 1.5 degrees centigrade maximum, the net zero, and of course the year 2050. And your view is that the framework has fundamental failings. I think you mentioned, which is very, very important because it's the basis of most of your conversation, which is basically that control, efficiency, and growth. If you put those three together, I think they lead to a policy logjam because it's not possible for one person. I mean, it's not possible that a solution will be found. And then you say that warming is the ultimate Pan-African issue because there's almost universal agreement among African countries about warming. I agree with you on that. I'm not too sure about whether we've agreed on the solutions, but you said it as well yourself, that if you look at the document itself, there are places that have parentheses suggesting that there's not an agreed solution. But that's expected, I think, for a complex issue. Then you took it down to how to fix it. And your view is that this is one area in which there's not going to be a global compact or solution unless Africa steps forward and takes the lead with confidence, but also with a superior proposal about how this problem might be solved. And your view is that Sub-Saharan Africa needs to propose ideas based on economics, a good understanding of externalities, and specifically that we have to get PIGU right. And getting PIGU right is basically to understand that when everybody talks about a carbon tax, I think you've raised it with us that there's some failings as well in which it is being applied to the question of global warming or greenhouse gases. The three important ones is basically that we're talking about it as if we're only responsible for managing the flows. And we're not talking about stocks, which is basically legacy pollution that has taken place, which has caused most of the problem, and for which the world is not, I mean, there's an asymmetry in terms of responsibility for that huge damage. We also think, I think you also are alerting us to not think of this problem as a single event. And if you think about it as a single event, I think you propose a suboptimal proposal, outcome, I mean, solution, and then the final one is basically that one of the things that the PIGU, Sassil PIGU's solution required, which the application as intended does not, is but basically it needs to return the offended party to the status ante. And that if we go about it without taking account of the stocks and only take account of the flow, then obviously about 140 countries, of course, the the African continent or countries in Africa are mostly there. Then the second part of your solution, which is the most interesting, I mean, actually novel for me, was basically on Pollack programming. Now the IEA had analyzed the Kenya's carbon finance law, which was basically a draft circulated about 3 months ago. And among the things we used was actually our view as well was that considering nominal pollution without actually weighting it by value added or by economic output could actually also mislead, and actually it could lead to quite a bit of cheating. So I think that you reinforce that is important. Emissions intensity outputs, I think we need to talk about not just emissions global totals, but basically the intensity for every unit of GDP points. And you measure it quite in a very innovative but actually very powerful way. And you say that the OECD are definitely off track, giving the data to show that. Part of that, of course, is that while they went, quite a lot of work went into that, but obviously that this was also subject to the shock of COVID. I think that's true, and you demonstrated that the emissions intensity output gives the correct signal. And when you show that, basically with respect to COVID, it shows that yes, COVID was quite a big one. I think also, in my view, you didn't say this, but re-emphasize this fact about why COVID as a global shock in itself was one instance in which global cooperation was demanded, because it actually had all effects on almost everybody else. It also, for that reason, that it was unanticipated, had effects on obviously these other global targets. Then, of course, it concentrates. I mean, you talk about the concentration on taxation on stock. That you speak about the fact that this new solution actually has no role for border adjustment. So if basically what we did was an annual application, we allow for competition, we tax the stock, then obviously I think there's less reason to do anything else. And what I like about it is basically it actually, you're proposing a simple applicable formula, which obviously provides the right incentives, and then every country can actually choose what to do without necessarily prescriptions on what energy choice or what kind of choices for development would be taken. And then you come to the final part, which is basically the governance. And I like what you say, that Africans proposing this solution or standing behind it, would be not victims, acting not as victims, but other adults, and led by the fact that what they should seek is efficiency, control, and at the same time preserving the huge scope for growth which many African countries still have. It's also to be guided not by financing, but in raising revenues, something that will be very exciting to the government of Kenya in particular, which has been hunting for revenues quite I mean, with Gusto, the opportunity to exploit carbon assets. I think the possibility for commercial carbon recapture, aggregate carbon efficiencies, and of course, then it will go from loans to grants. And obviously, this would be unconstrained revenues which governments could use. And most importantly, I think you raised two questions, which brings me back to my point. The first point is basically my understanding about carbon taxation and its application. Even on the proposal that you have here, I understood it as basically if you apply carbon taxes in the way that it should be applied, it could be applied in ways that are revenue neutral, in the sense that some other cuts would have to be made in one place to allow for the new revenues to actually compensate. But the main effect of that carbon tax is that it shifts incentives to allow people to choose and to make choices. You are suggesting here, and I hope I've not misquoted you, but you're suggesting that here that it would be additional revenue. Is that right or not? So that's my first question. The second question is basically one of the things that I didn't see as connected, and I tend to be in global things. Now, African countries and a good number of developing countries actually have the problem of debt carrying capacity now. It's quite salient because of legacy loans. For many reasons, some of them invested in infrastructure and other assets that were not necessarily respectful of carbon intensity in their production. I didn't see that connection, and I was thinking the climate statement was actually a contriving, forcing the connection between debt carrying capacity and Africa's debt crisis to the climate change question. And I was wondering whether here was just an appropriate platform with which to actually project again the concern about Africa's debt. But I did not see the direct connection to debt carrying capacity at the sovereign level. So maybe you could also explain that quite a bit. So I'll allow you to answer those two questions, and then we'll open up the conversation to the rest of the audience.
Kwame, those are great questions, and if you'll allow me to start with the second one, because it's the one that I am most animated about in the last couple of days. So let me just speak now very bluntly. One of the things that's been stressed a great deal in the last couple of years by climate activists is the target of $100 billion per year of new financing going into the developing world associated with climate. At the same time as that has become an almost totemic objective of the activists, including as stated in the Nairobi Declaration, it is already the case that a very large swathe of the developing world is already in debt distress. They cannot carry the debt which they already have. And now comes these climate activists going to pile a whole lot of new debt on these countries. To put it very bluntly, this is insane. This as an agenda simply cannot work. It will neither help these countries because they become drowning in even more debt, and because of that, it won't help fix the global climate problem either. This is why the very last point that I stressed on revenue is so very important. The emphasis should not be on increasing finance to the developing world in connection to this climate crisis. It should be in increasing revenue to them. And indeed, go then to the first of your questions. Most certainly, the revenue implications that I have shown are additional. This is largely because what is happening is the revenue sources that I identified come from outside, if you like, of the developing world. This is not the developing world increasing its own revenue through structural reform and internal changes and tax mobilization domestically. It's coming from fixing the global framework on warming, such that the people who made the problem are required to fix it and not everybody else. And that explains, I think, Kwame, how I answer your question about your point about, well, surely in the case of a global carbon tax, and not the thing that I'm proposing, a global carbon tax, surely that is just one form of revenue versus another. We're not necessarily getting additional revenue in that case. In that case, your argument is correct. There's not necessarily any additional revenue for the poor world, the developing world, in the context of a global carbon tax. But in my scheme, which is not that, it's an emissions inefficiency tariff, there are 8 new sources of revenue generated. And the last of those 8 is the fact of greater debt carrying capacity, which would allow them to borrow more and invest and hence increase their growth. So under my scheme, there is most definitely an enormous amount of additionality of revenue for the developing world. In the case of the global carbon tax, there's potentially no additional revenue at all.
Right. Okay. Thanks a lot. So thanks, Peter. Yeah, that's clearer to me now. So we're distinguishing the global, emissions inefficiency tariff from a generalized carbon tax, which is basically what many people understand the carbon tax today to be trying to achieve. So that's clear. Can I have any questions? I haven't seen any in the chat box. There's a facility right at the top of the menu bar, which allows you to raise your hand. So if anybody has a question, please raise your hands so that Peter could respond to any of your questions on any of the issues that you think he needs clarification on. Or okay, so there's Chris Dominique. Please unmute yourself and ask your questions. Go ahead, Chris.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, so I've listened to Mr. Doyle, and on the carbon emissions, here's what I noticed. For the developing countries, we have noticed that if they are used to consuming a certain level of energy, you will have to replace, for example, let's say coal or let's say oil. These are fossil fuels. If you don't understand the best attributes of those energy sources, it will be hard to actually replace them. That's why we do find that Germany, even though they did try to go green, they have reverted back to coal. And you also find, like, let's say Spain or some of these European countries, they have reverted back to fossil fuels because their industrialization cannot be facilitated using the renewable energy. And when it comes to the carbon emissions, I would like you also to kindly mention why we already know that wind has an issue, because you find that wind and solar are parasitic to fossil fuels when it comes to the manufacturing of them. So you find China is actually making the solar panels and also the wind panels. Wind panels, we already know they cannot be recyclable, but they are highly reliant on coal energy. So we are finding that the whole narrative about renewables, they are actually banking on fossil fuels to generate themselves, even though, let's say, they do have a lower efficiency. For solar, it's at least 26. For wind, is a bit 40. So and on the nuclear side, this is the part that I really don't understand, why there's a lot of pushback on nuclear energy, yet it's the most sensible energy option for the entire world to go carbon neutral. If let's say that was the point. And on the carbon tax, here is where I really I don't agree with you on the carbon tax, since if you're going to go for carbon reducing carbon in the atmosphere, there is the expensive method of using those technology of sucking off carbon from the atmosphere. Yes, and it's expensive, but there's also the natural way, which is trees. Now, if you look at all the top 10, the top 5 emitting countries, so Russia, China, the US, Canada, and Australia, they do have a large forested area. So if, let's say, we are to force that in the entire world, we find that it's only DRC that actually has a forested area that we could say it's actually doing the planet a lot good. But if you're going to go for a global, or let's say a carbon tax globally, then you will find that most African countries will actually be buying carbon credits from the developing world in dollars, because if let's say people are going to be using afforestation to show that they are reducing emissions, then Russia's forested area that covers 1/5 of the world's land area is actually on top, then followed by the US, followed by Canada, the US, Brazil, Peru, and Australia, of which now the entire conversation about carbon taxes and the global north should compensate the global south doesn't really make sense if let's say we're going to attribute all things together, keeping in mind that developed countries are not going to just sit around and just feed off their money to the developing world. And also, when it comes to us industrializing, we'll have to buy credit so we can push ourselves to the same level as the developed countries.
Okay, Kwame, shall I address those?
Yes, yes, please go ahead.
Okay, Chris, thank you very much. You said in the middle of that at one point that you thought you disagreed with me. I'm going to try and persuade you that actually you agree with me on virtually everything that you have said. Those were very perceptive points. I want to start with your point, which I very strongly agree with, that the kind of assumption that the developing world can, develop it to its full potential with subject to emissions constraints is essentially, I'm paraphrasing, is a nonsense. I agree with you. That claim is a nonsense. When you hear phrases like, the developing world is going to leapfrog in technology, words like leapfrog indicate that the person doesn't know what they're talking about, even if that person happens to be a McKinsey consultant to the government of Kenya and preparing the proposals for the summit. The very strong economic evidence is that when low-income countries begin to grow and develop to slightly less low-income, higher, their emissions intensities of output go up because you're expanding the manufacturing sector, and that draws in from all sorts of mechanisms increased emissions intensity. So on that, I agree with you absolutely completely. On the question of whether the rich world is just going to kind of sit there and do all these things, I want to pick up and sort of just allow all this to happen. I want to pick up that a little bit later because I'm hoping that someone will ask a question about, well, how is Africa going to actually make all of this happen in the world? Can it get allies from the rich world and elsewhere for the emissions intensity tariff? But I'll leave that to, I'm trying to stoke a question there to lead you on. But you do raise that question, Chris, and I'm just highlighting that there. So the key point I want to make to you then, the last point is that, yes, this will lead to a very large increase in revenues for the developing world, even though countries like Russia have potential great forested areas. If it's the case that Russia increases its forestry, as one would hope that it does, it would do so under my scheme in order that it does not become liable for the emissions inefficiency tariff. That would be part of the global solution to getting temperatures under control. Russia cannot then sell, if you like, that into the carbon market, because if it sells it, then it doesn't get the benefit in the accounting system of the tax for its own efforts. That benefit then goes to somebody else. So Russia would only have an incentive to do this, to reforest itself, to the extent that that is going to allow it to avoid liability for the emissions inefficiency tariff. The rest of the carbon market remains to be supplied by the Africans and by whomever, including the DRC and whomever else. So I don't see that the Russian threat that you mentioned there is actually a significant one in the scheme that I am proposing of the emissions inefficiency tariff.
All right. There's a question here about, I don't know if you responded to it, but maybe it was coiled up in the rest of your responses. I think Dominic mentioned something about those pushback against nuclear solutions. So let me ask a question here as I wait for anybody else to raise their hand. Do you think that if this emissions inefficiency tariff were introduced, and I like the fact that you say, like, look, there is no prescription about what policy choices or what energy choices any country should take. Do you think that might raise the profile of nuclear energy, especially for high-income countries, just based on the fact that a tariff would be in force.
Yes, it might, because by increasing their discipline on the rich world in order to get their emissions intensities down and giving them an unconstrained choice about what exactly they do, they have a full menu, and one of the menu options they have is to go more nuclear. But I wouldn't only emphasize the point about the nuclear issue there. Right now, there's a very important issue to do with the fact of they're returning to coal. Okay, so given that they're returning to coal, there is a significant loss of the value and so on. So in that context, it will be important to allow them full discretion. And if you have particular concern about the role of nuclear, that would be a concern to be addressed elsewhere. Now, I want to just make elsewhere in the sense of domestically, let's say the Germans may decide we don't like nuclear, even though we are subject to this tariff, we don't want to do it. But on the other hand, they may decide that that is the best way they can find of getting their emissions intensities down. But to the extent that there's therefore now a sort of a global concern, I don't know, the potential damage and fallout from, meltdowns in nuclear plants and that kind of thing, that would have to be addressed sort of in the nuclear world, of governance of nuclear matters in the world to sort that particular problem out. But yes, it might. But I do want to make sort of another particular point on that, if I may, Kwame. And this goes back to the point I made about the rich world treating you with contempt. They talk at length about we're all in this together and we must all make an effort and so on. But in the case of the last couple of years, as soon as the rich world has a certain inconvenience, let's call it that, with this whole climate agenda arising from the Ukraine war, they call it, energy security and so on, what do? They immediately revert to carbon-based sources of energy at Africa's expense, because so you're not only out of the Ukraine war facing high food and fertilizer prices, you've now got also more emissions coming your way. Okay, and they've simply dropped this all in together business because it becomes slightly inconvenient for them. In the context of an emissions inefficiency tariff, if they were to decide that they needed to go back to some more coal sources of energy, if they then wanted to avoid liability for the tariff, they would have to compensate by doing something else more to offset their increased emissions from the change in the production of energy. It now is no longer at Africa's expense. They would have to deal with that internally, and if they fail to do so, the worst of their members would become liable for the tariff. And that's the discipline. So the emissions inefficiency tariff actually gives teeth to this grand claim that we're all in this together. Teeth which are totally absent now.
All right. So I see that Dominic has another question. I'd like to allow others as well to ask. I can't see any questions in the chat box. Please alert me if they're there. So Dominic, you'll have your second chance. I have a question as well, but let me let you go first.
Okay. I would like to seek clarification from Doyle on carbon. First of all, what percentage do you think that carbon actually affects global temperatures, keeping in mind that there's also the Milankovitch cycles, of which now that's beyond us? And then on the second question, it comes to how carbon markets. There was a report, I think, it was by Interpol 2013-2014, where carbon markets were being used by organized crime, where they could profit shift. So I set up let's say one of these projects to gain carbon credits in African countries. Of course, we are pushing for that. Then I buy off those credits. The company is in one of these low tax jurisdiction. Then afterwards, I sell them to a company. Since I've evaded taxes, they can now sell them those profits back to European countries. I understand that European countries have taken the carbon credits a bit more seriously. It was shut down in the US when people tried to lobby for it. So there was that. That's the second issue. And on the third one, when it comes to the push for the EV, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, when it comes for the push for the EV, there are reports by Volkswagen and Volvo. They had said if you're going to be pushing, since if you want a huge mileage, so for Volvo, if you want batteries to go further in mileage, then the production of those batteries, you actually emit more. So it becomes a net emitter rather than offsetting. And then Volkswagen mentioned that the process of creating these EVs, you actually produce 10 tons of CO2 emissions before you actually start driving your vehicles. And actually you have to clock, I think, 60,000 miles. So you can actually beat the internal combustion engines in the emissions. And they understand that UK has gone full blown on the emissions of vehicles. And here we have our good treasury trying to push the carbon taxes on combustion vehicles. So those are my three main questions. Thank you.
Okay,
Peter,
that's
go ahead.
great. To answer the first of those, let me go back to sharing my screen for a minute. Okay, can you now see the chart on the screen, everybody?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so your first question was, what is the connection between emissions and temperatures? Well, I'm going to give this as my economic rather than the scientific. This is an economic answer. The sum of the three colored blocks is the estimate of the total stock of emissions in the world. And the black squiggly line is global temperatures. You don't need to be an economist to see at the first glance that these are very, very highly correlated. We know correlation is not necessarily causation, but the science gives us causation here. But the numbers give us the economics. We can very clearly see the correlation. So if there are, to those who, as Connie mentioned at the beginning, this fringe of people who still deny this, it's not only science that is against them, it's also the economics as reflected in this chart that I have just shown you there. So that's my answer to the first of your questions, Dominic. Again, presenting, I'll go back to the other two. On the question of the, you mentioned an absolutely crucial issue, which is fraud in the carbon markets. Fraud being a major problem right now. And you cited some correct, specific examples of it. Certainly in the detailed proposals that I have made, there is direct attack on that fraud, fraud in the carbon market, because implicit and indeed necessary in the framework that I'm proposing for an emissions inefficiency tariff is an effective global carbon market. Therefore, you have to deal with the fraud, and I've got a whole range of proposals supporting this to do with the governance of the emissions inefficiency tariff itself. To do so, I can spell them out in detail if you like. But all I want to say is that the proposal I'm making has a full set of answers to them. In particular, I mean, just the headline answer is the emissions inefficiency tariff would require a new global institution on climate to administer it. And one of the new tasks of that new institution, be quite a small institution, but a new one nonetheless, would be effective discipline and management against fraud of people playing in the carbon market. I also want to pick up on your last point, Dominic, which was to do with EV batteries and the fact that they take more emissions to produce in a long time. You have to drive cars a long way before you actually get to a net gain. the way in which my proposal, the emission efficiency tariff, addresses that general problem, so not just in EV, but in elsewhere too, in a whole range of other areas, is by having a single aggregate measure of emissions intensity of output for each country. So my proposal is specifically avoiding attacking specific sectors. I don't go after oil, I don't go after gas, I don't go after coal, I don't go after aviation, I don't go after people raising cattle and meat and so on. I say I'm just concerned with the aggregate. And the reason that I'm just concerned with the aggregate here is because that's what the Pigovian solution is. You in Africa are not externalized by coal or by oil or by any of these individual things. You are externalized by the aggregate. And hence it's the correction of the aggregate that matters, not the individual components. So if some quote unquote corrective measures have some unintended consequences to raise carbon, that will be subject under my tariff system to that discipline, and the countries pursuing those will be essentially penalized if indeed in net terms that turns out to be a loss in terms of more emissions than they thought, and so on. And that's how, by focusing on the aggregate, not on individual sectors, you address in the system I'm proposing that particular problem that you raise about electric vehicles.
All right. Peter, there's a second question here by Leo. So Leo, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, for the presentation, and you've proposed a very interesting solution. Now, my question is in two parts. The first part is, what you and me know that it's one thing to propose. What do you think are some of the political economy considerations or oops that Africa needs to jump in order to make the proposal a success? Secondly, what's your view about CBAMs? Because it looks like the EU is already going on with it, and that could be a global norm going in the near future. What's your perspective about it?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't hear what was that acronym? You said, what's the view of, I think, CBAMs or something? Is that border adjustment taxes? Is that what you're asking about?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
okay, great. Okay. So two great questions. Again, I'm going to need to hold on a minute while to answer the first, I'm going to need some additional slides. There we go. Okay. Please bear with me while I'm nearly ready for you. Okay, so you can hopefully see a screen which is called governance.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so Leo, your first question was about what about the political economy of what I'm proposing? Will anybody support Africa in making all of this happen? An excellent question. I'm going to answer this kind of in two phases. In the first phase, Africa as a whole doesn't require any support from anybody else. The first phase is Africa simply presents the numbers that I have shown. It says it actually does the calculation for the targets, it sets the targets, it measures the outturn against the targets, it tells everybody who the worst performers are. At this point, you don't need any support. Africa can simply go to the COP and say, these are the numbers. These are the numbers based on a coherent economic framework telling us in very concrete terms, are we off track? Are we on track? And who are the people who are individually we need to call out in the rich world for generating this problem? This doesn't require any support. This doesn't require the rich world to allow Africa to come to the top table and all of these things. You can do this unilaterally, assert it. And of course, they're not going to necessarily welcome you with open arms. So fine, you do it again next year, you do it the year after that, and keep on and on saying this is the proper way, this is the adult way of getting control of this global problem. Africa doesn't need support. By doing it annually, you build global awareness of the idea. You also build support for the idea within the African continent itself. Bear in mind that by being based on a carbon unconstrained assumption for the whole of the African continent north of the Limpopo, I have got a means of bringing the entire African continent together behind these proposals. Okay? All of that diversity of opinion that you saw in the Nairobi conference will largely dissipate under this agreement, because all of the countries, South Africa is the exception we can talk about and how to deal with that, because it's one of the big group of non-OECD emitters. But this gets the whole African Union behind this, and the country, Africa, can do this on its own. But there's now a second phase, because just doing this and embarrassing the countries who are making this problem is not enough. They are shameless. So to get support for the whole enforcement mechanism of the emissions inefficiency tariff, I say you need to find allies in the rich world. You need to literally divide them and find some allies there. Where can those allies be found? Well, take a look at this chart. This chart shows the emissions intensity of output for the OECD relative average for all their individual members. On the left-hand side, you can see the worst performers. There they are, Canada, Australia, and Korea. But now cast your eye over to the right-hand side of this chart. Now, for those countries, they are making great efforts to solve the global problem of warming through their own emissions efficiency of output by being very emissions efficient. But their efforts to do that are being overridden and spoiled by their confreres on the left, who are very inefficient. So these countries on the right-hand side of the chart have an incentive to sign up to the emissions inefficiency tariff because they will not be liable to it. It's only the worst members of the OECD, that's Canada, Australia, and Korea in 2021, will become liable. And if you look in detail on your screen as to which those countries on the right-hand side are, it includes some very big ones. There's France in there. There's the United Kingdom in there. There is Spain in that group. There's a bunch of powerful and important countries who are persuadable that the emissions intensity tariff is something they should sign up to because they will not be liable to it. In addition, the point I didn't develop in the talk, but is important, is the basis for the revenue allocation from the emissions efficiency tariff to the rest of the world should not be on the basis of poor and rich and so on. It should be on the basis of each country's share in global GDP. So Germany would get its share of global GDP of the pool of revenue collected by this tariff. Why do you do that? Because that now gives Germany a second reason to sign up the emissions and efficiency tariff to get its share of what could be 1% of US GDP, a very large sum of money. So that gives you two very strong reasons why countries on the right-hand side of this chart would be amenable to support Africa. And the third factor which will bring them on board is the point that Kwame stressed, which is that the tax is so parsimonious. We are not interfering in Germany's or the UK's or France's individual policy choices. We leave that to their sovereignty to select and to decide. So it's a non-invasive system which gives them access to potentially a large pool of revenue even for them, and it stops them from having their own climate efforts being destroyed by inefficient members of the OECD itself. That's the basis for Africa to pitch for their support for the emissions intensity tariff. And just very briefly, this is the same chart but now produced for the big non-OECD emitters. Again, look who's over on the right-hand side of this chart. People who are potentially supported. It includes India, it includes Brazil. Would potentially be persuadable to sign up for such an emissions efficiency tariff. So I think the political economy side of it is feasible in a way that almost all other proposals for dealing with this problem are not. Now, if I can stop sharing this to your second question, Leo, where you were asking about the border adjustment taxes. I made very clear in my statement, I'll just reiterate again, in a system of a global emissions inefficiency tariff, there is no place for border adjustment taxes, none, because the emissions inefficiency tariff addresses the global externality effectively. And once it is addressed effectively, you don't need any other instruments like a border adjustment tax to do so. In that context, if you do apply a border adjustment tax, it's for purely protectionist reasons, no other. There's no climate reason to do that anymore, because the discipline is being provided globally by a superior tax. And incidentally, it's not just border adjustment taxes that would be ruled out in the scheme that I'm proposing. So would climate conditionality applied by the IMF to countries in the 140. And that includes Kenya. I mean, Kenya's current program is just littered with climate conditionality of all kinds. In the context of a global emissions inefficiency tariff, there would be none. No climate conditionality applied through the IMF program to Kenya, for the same reason, because the global externality is addressed by a superior instrument, namely by the emissions inefficiency tariff.
All right. Thanks a lot. Now, I have two questions. I think first is something that you preempted, which is about the elephant in the room. Not all African countries fall under the same basket. In a way, they're different. And if you look at the African Climate Summit last week, it was as important to notice who attended as who did not attend. And some of Africa's biggest, I'll call them Africa's economic heavyweights, Nigeria in particular, South Africa were conspicuously absent. The reasons that were given were all formal reasons about commitments that the leaders for both countries had made. But it is significant when you look at it, and if you try to apply the formula that you've given us, that they're actually some of Africa's biggest polluters on the continent itself. So on a net basis, maybe an eloquent argument hasn't been made to them, but actually the idea was that they did not think, perhaps they did not give this as much, they did not think it was a priority conditional, dependent, in addition, considering other obligations that those states have. Let me ask a clear question. One of the things that I find interesting is, if you talk about the emissions inefficiency tariff, is it possible for somebody sitting back, say in Germany or in another country of the world, which would have big obligations based on the application of the formula, and therefore would have to cede some money, to ask, okay, fine, we ban coal or we ban fuel, we ban petroleum sources, but we import it from Nigeria, for instance, or import it from Kenya. Kenya doesn't have, but let's say we import it from a certain African country. And therefore, the responsibility for banning lies with us. What about the fact that these are also countries that have quite been responsible for it? We're going to bear all the costs and all that. So what does that mean for the trade in this service? In these goods and services, mining, for instance, for which obviously some African countries also have. I know you mentioned that because of legacy questions, we cannot ask, we need to deal with the stock first before we talk about the flow, and these would be questions of flow. But some of the petroleum that has been banned, which created some of these gas emissions, were traded by African countries who are either members of OPEC or anything else. Does that question make sense in the context of the emissions inefficiency tariff? So that's the first one. The second question I'd like to ask is, I think if the emissions inefficiency tariff were imposed and there was an international organization, I'm sure they would need to have a fund to store the money in and then to use it. To be able to do the accounting and to have a ledger. What I'm asking myself is, for how long do you think it might have to be maintained? Or is it something that would exist as an institution permanently throughout the development cycle of many nations? Is it something that would have to be considered phased out at one point, say, for instance, is it a 25, 30, or 50-year policy engagement, enforcement, or is it something that would actually have to be done for a while? And do you think that the behavioral changes that it would induce would actually provide sufficient correction, and over time it might actually have to work itself out of a job? Yeah, let me hear from you.
Okay, thanks again. Actually, I counted 3 core questions to answer there from you, Kwame. So the first point you made was noting the significance of absentees from the Nairobi summit, and you quoted Nigeria and South Africa. Actually, I would point to a wider view. I think it's very notable that the Mozambican president wasn't there. I think it's very notable that Museveni wasn't there. Also, that the president of Zimbabwe wasn't there. So there are a couple of I would actually cast the net even wider than you did. My own interpretation of their absence is not, I think, that they thought that global warming is not an important issue, but that they felt that the main thrust of the proposals that were going to come out of this, particularly the idea that Africa itself should go green as a core part of the proposal, is not something that they could sign up to. So the oil exporters as a group would obviously have an enormous question about all of that. Is Angola really going to be required to shut down its oil industry, or indeed Nigeria? It's simply not a feasible thing. So again, I'm going to raise this point about this as McKinsey agenda appearing through the Nairobi Declaration, dividing Africa, because it's got this whole we have to go green part of it, which of course these other countries simply cannot, under any circumstances, sign up to. The way in which my own proposal addresses that issue is by removing the carbon constraint. Nigeria, if it's told that it doesn't have to eliminate its oil industry, if Angola is told it doesn't have to eliminate its oil industry, but in fact can fully exploit them, they will turn around and say, well, now we're listening. Now we are on board. This is how Africa gets pulled together under my proposal. The only country which would be an exception, the only one in Africa under my rule, under my approach, would be South Africa, because it is one of the large emitters. And they may turn around and say, hold on, we don't want to be liable to this emissions inefficiency tariff, despite our contribution to the stock. And they might also specifically refer in the historical connection to the production of these enormous emissions in South Africa by the former minority governments of that country. And they would say, why do we have to carry the burden of that now? To that, I would say to the rest of Africans, you're simply going to have to push the South Africans on this matter and say, it is not as though you're the only people who are going to solve the global problem of warming. It is we also in Africa will help solve it, because we may be paid to do so through the carbon recapture and other things that we do. We get the revenue sources from it. You could also say to them, and I would be perfectly happy to advise the South African government myself on this, I can find very clear ways of ensuring that any burden on South Africa from being liable to the emissions inefficiency tariff can be carried by the formerly privileged and powerful population there, not by the entire population of South Africa. It's not a difficult job, technically, to design a means of distributing the burden of that to the community where it actually belongs, inside South Africa. So there's no need for South Africa to hide behind its formerly privileged population there on this matter. But even so, if South Africa is still a holdout, they just will not sign up to this arrangement and so on, well, then they become a holdout. And on this, I just want to emphasize a whole thing. Because of the design of the system, the emissions inefficiency tariff, a holdout cannot veto. The inefficiency tariff is collected by everybody else in the world on the offending country's exports. So if even if the United States doesn't want to sign up to this because it thinks it's liable, but the rest of the world says we're on board, well, you can still impose that tax on all US exports. And if it's South Africa that is the holdout, I'm sorry, South Africa, your exports will still be taxed, and we hope that eventually you'll come to your sense senses and join the rest of your brothers and sisters in Africa in supporting this agenda. But the only country that is a standout in Africa, potential standout in Africa, under my proposal is South Africa, and that is how I would address that particular problem. On your second issue, Kwame, which is to do with the fact that potentially a country which is liable to the emissions and efficiency tariff takes action against some industry like coal, and that industry then moves somewhere else. Okay, that is exactly what happens and should happen in a free trade framework. That's not something wrong, that is something right. Because, of course, under free trade and competition, industries move from place to place according to comparative advantage. Once you've established an emissions efficiency tariff globally, which is addressing the global externality, after that, it's free trade. And you let industries move where they move in accordance with the profit maximizing and free trade objectives, because the externality is properly addressed. The last question you raised there was concerning the duration of this institution and the proposal. Okay, this is a very long-range problem, because the problem does not end in 2050. I mean, there will still be need to maintain discipline to prevent fossil fuels reappearing, even after that period of time where they've been eliminated and so on. So potentially there will be need for an institution to manage this whole process almost in perpetuity. I mean, depending on, of course, what happens. Very difficult to know what happens in, you know, the year 3000 or something. But this is clearly going to be an institution which has a very long life, and certainly will be a major role in the lives of everybody who is listening to this webinar, and potentially all of your children as well. So it will be around and will be needed for a very long time. On the question of sort of natural contributions to emissions, I refer you again to the chart that I showed you about how closely correlated they are with, if you like, man-made emissions. But in addition, what the scientists tell us is that the damage, let's say, which is coming from the oceans, is not independent of the emissions. So, you know, the reason why the polar ice cap is shrinking is that's not a natural, that is not caused by natural events. That is caused by the fact of emissions by humans. So a good deal of the damage, if you like, that is being done in terms of raising global temperatures through sort of indirect natural effects is very considerable, but those natural effects are actually arising primarily because of the emissions from the human emissions. So it's just a mechanism by which this is actually transmitted from emissions into higher temperatures. And that is captured, those factors are captured in, you know, the estimated relationship that there is between the stock of emissions and global temperatures. Now, a point I think that you might want to make is that relationship might in future change. I mean, we can see what it is from the last 60 years of data that I just showed you in the chart. 10 years from now, we might have crossed some kind of tipping point and so on, and that relationship would change, might have changed. If so, then the basic equation that we're using, linking the stock of emissions to temperature, we would have to adjust. We have new information about what the relationship is, and you factor that into the programming at the point where you actually understand it. But in the meantime, what you do is organize global policy on the best basis of what we know now. Not fixed forever. If 10 years' time we learn some more, well, then we factor in the new learning that we have then, and we adjust all of our parameters of the tax and so on accordingly. Okay, so this is the underlying analytical basis of this is not fixed in stone. It's the best understanding that, you know, the economics profession and the scientific profession can produce at the moment, and you base global policy on the best knowledge that we have. It may change. So I think that is a crucial point, I think, to add to your point about natural factors. On the question of are we concerned, would some countries be concerned at the loss of cheap Chinese goods? if China is now taking an aggressive stance to reduce its own emissions? Well, I'm going to answer you again quite provocatively. There's a whole group of countries, 55 countries in the world, who would be very, very pleased to see that happen. And those are the 55 countries in Africa. Because if China is becoming more expensive as a producer of goods on account of addressing its emissions properly, that increases the space in the global market for African manufacturing to replace it, to displace it. This is yet another potential source of revenue for the African continent arising out of this. So, and indeed, the whole 140 countries would be very pleased, who are exempt from this thing, would be very pleased to see this happen. There may still be, as you say, some other countries in the rich world in the OECD who don't want to lose access to cheap Chinese imports. Okay, those countries would simply have to weigh: do we want the problem of global warming solved, or do we want cheap Chinese goods? And I think Africa has a fairly good case to make through the COPs and others that it's better not to warm, even for the rich world, given the catastrophic weather and other consequences you will suffer, than it is to have a cheap Chinese watch.
Thank you, Peter. So I'd like you to make any concluding remarks, and more particularly, because the kind of people who attend these tend to be a policy crowd, people who are either researchers, people who are professionals. What kind of messages should they be listening to from our leaders to actually know that they've got the right? I mean, they've sized up the problem properly, and that the solutions that they're proposing are consistent with a drift towards the solutions that you have alerted us to.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kwame, and thank you very much for all those who've attended patiently and listened to these proposals. So in summary, I'd just make an answer to that a few points. I want to stress again what I said at the very beginning. Yeah, for me, the important thing about the Nairobi summit and the climate conference is that it happened. That is a major step, in my view, forward, because clearly the Africans are no longer interested in simply relegating this problem to a bunch of technocrats to go to COPs and moan and complain and then forget it. They're elevating this to a continental-wide political level where it needs to be. That said, there's clearly need for much greater specificity. The proposals that they've come up with are at a very high level of abstraction. What I'm outlining here in the seminar today is a set of very specific, concrete, measurable, deliverable proposals, which they can advance as delivering the meat of the Nairobi summit and putting meat, if you like, on the bones of its aspirations, but very detailed in a way that brings the whole continent together, which deals with the problem of these absentees. Because it's based on rigorous sound economics, it will actually work to get control of global temperatures. It will address the core problem that the scientists have in predicting temperatures, which is that they don't know what the stock of emissions will be. This proposal addresses that concern. It will actually help the scientists to better tell us what exactly the temperature trajectory is likely to be. In terms of one other thing, I hope that particularly those amongst the policy crowd who might be here are not sitting there assuming that I myself am going to be able to take this proposal forward into Africa to the leaders and so on. I have no access to any of the leaders of Africa. I require those people in the policy crowd who might be listening now to take this up themselves, actively, personally. Say, there is actually a way of doing this. We really should look very closely to it. We should assign within our governments, our technical people, to crawl over this idea of an emissions efficiency tariff, make sure that it works, understand the implications, the measure, where the numbers come from, how the institution will work, and really think through any of the potential downfalls that there might be, some of those issues we raised today. So I'd call on some real activism by potential participants in this seminar and people who may be watching the video thereafter. At the end of the day, I'm just somebody trying to help. I have no political traction myself. But I do think that one of the animating factors that I hope will animate you to do this is that an understanding that you are first in line for the hits. That means the policy framework failings that we've discussed are your problem. Nobody else is going to come and rescue you. The rich world is not going to do it. The international financial institutions are not going to do it. The NGOs are not going to do it. The economics profession is not going to do it. Africa has to, as the saying goes, stand up itself, put together a coalition with the other 140 countries and make this case. And set aside the kind of nonsensical leapfrogging, notions, green technology is going to come and save us, which is sort of McKinsey type, I have to say, economic nonsense, which is out there. This is what I'm proposing is an adult-based, coherent, disciplined, numerical system to back up global efforts to get control of warming for not only the benefit of Africa in a sort of Pan-African sense, but by the Pan-Africans doing this, literally solving the problem for the world.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think we should come out of this. It's very difficult to summarize our conversation today, but I'll mention two things that are important. It's clear now that as a policy problem, I think global warming and greenhouse gases emissions are very strongly correlated. The world is alive to the fact that this is a problem. I think the outstanding problem is a solution. So that's the first point. The second point is that the African Climate Summit shows some level of leadership by Africa generally, but more particularly by the President of Kenya and the Republic. But it's not enough to simply state the problem, to restate the problem, and then to call on people to act to their best, as better angels of their own nature. So yes, while the calls were out there, I think a proper diagnosis of the problem suggests that apart from the platitudes and actually accepting that this is an issue that needs to be solved, this climate summit would actually get better traction and would be remembered much, much more if they put in concrete solutions here. We're suggesting, as Peter's told us, that the approach that he proposes, emissions inefficiency tariff, bring that to the table. We have 2 months before COP, I think a couple of months before COP 28 in Abu Dhabi. And I think that, rather, in the UAE, and that's obviously an opportunity. I don't know whether that's enough time for people in government to actually conjure up a strong proposal using some of the data that has been placed here and force that as an alternative to the very woolly conversations that I've had about it. Part of the most embarrassing things about the COP arguments is people come up with a lot of enthusiasm, but when you read the texts, as they call them, they tend to be extremely woolly and a conversation which tries to actually shift and kick everything into the future. So when we come up with a quantitative approach, suggesting how this then would divide responsibility, because it's a common responsibility by the sovereigns, and each of them then taking responsibility for that, together with a new institutional model to enforce it, I think that's much, much further. And that should perhaps be the basis of a conversation here. I think the chance is available for Kenya to push this forward. It had a lot of goodwill coming from this. And those who came in here and wanted to support perhaps should now be asked to put something, some diplomatic, political capital behind the good and congratulatory words that they did. But I think what I liked most about this is that, yes, it removes the carbon constraint, which would be a big development constraint for African countries or developing countries generally. And I think the possibility of using this proposal to galvanize action and advocacy at the global level by sovereign countries, all 140 of them, starting with 55 on the African continent, is a very strong proposal that should be an alternative one placed before. And after that, of course, it will be the power of argument and the power of evidence leading to the solutions that are created. Because yes, this is a problem that's not going to wait for us. So I'm very thankful here. And Peter, thank you very much for bringing this to my attention. I think you've been very kind of seeking to have this conversation. But I think we also have a convergence in the sense that it was an appropriate moment to have this conversation going. I'd like to alert all of us here that Peter has a lecture on this matter, which was a password that I watched before we decided to have this conversation. A link of it will be provided in the box here. We provided it together with the invite, but it will be available for you to please read it again. I think it's a far more coherent, it's a very educative, discussion of all the issues, the data has been placed here, the approaches, and obviously what kind of outcomes to anticipate. So on behalf of the Institute of Economic Affairs, I thank you, Peter, for indulging us with your time. Thank you very much for being here and making the presentation. And I hope we can ask you to allow us to circulate or to provide a link to the presentation that you did today, because many people will be interested in actually studying it further. I've seen people in the chat box saying that they'd like us to have a discussion. I mean, they'd like to be more acquainted with your ideas. So ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for being here. Thanks for spending your time, and we hope we can keep this conversation going.